Hey, this is Joe at graybenchelec. Welcome back to the pedal teardown series where I take apart new and interesting pedals and show you what's going on inside. Today we have the Greer Amps Soma 63. All right, so we got the Soma 63 from Greer Amps. This is another one of the amp-in-a-box style pedals. It falls into the second category of pedals that are trying to replicate the circuit of a usually vintage tube amp. There's sort of two categories of amp-in-a-box style pedals. You have pedals that are trying to sound like usually a vintage tube amp, and there's pedals that are trying to replicate the circuit of a vintage tube amp. This is the latter category. The Soma 63 is based on the Fender brownface style amplifiers. It substitutes JFETs instead of tubes, which is a reasonable substitution. JFETs and tubes work on the same principle of a field of negative charge controlling the flow of electrons from the cathode to the anode, or from, in this case, the source to the drain. Obviously, the pedal here is going to run at significantly lower voltages than a real tube amp. Real tube amps are going to be anywhere from 200 to 500 volts. The Soma here has no charge pump, so it's running from, at best, whatever you put into it. So the 9 to 18 volts that's marked here. The circuit of the Soma 63 here is based on sort of a mishmash of two different brownface style amps, and we'll look at that in a little bit. For right now, let's check out the outside of the enclosure. So we have 5 controls: volume, gain, presence, bass, and treble, silkscreen or UV printed graphics, little transformer, logo Greer X-former. There is a transformer inside, and we'll see that in a second. Greer Amps, Athens, Georgia. Output and inputs are clearly marked. Top-sided jacks, quarter-inch jacks, and 9-volt DC input jack. The enclosure size is the standard 125B or 1590N1 is the Hammond equivalent. Standard latching foot switch, feels like just one of the standard blue or maybe one of the alpha foot switches. The LED bezel is sort of it's got the Fresnel lens on top, but it's also sort of standoff. The LED can come out into this little enclosure here, and it helps spread the light out, but it is somewhat susceptible if maybe a harsh foot can come across and maybe hit that, so there's a trade-off. The outside, it looks like a cream powder coat. On the back here, we have this pedal was sent in to me by a viewer. You know who you are. Thank you very much. They have what looks like the serial number and maybe the builder initials written in Sharpie, which I don't think is a good idea. These are important information to have for any warranty stuff, so these should at least be written on the inside where they're not going to face the elements. But and then a couple pieces of pedal tape. And the knobs here are what I call like the MXR fluted style knobs. They're the smaller size, not like the full size you see on the MXR phaser and whatnot, but that's the style. And yeah, I think that's about it for the outside. Let's go ahead and crack it open. All right, I'm gonna leave the PCB in the enclosure because they have some stuff like hot glue in here that I don't wanna have to redo. So here is the PCB assembly for the Soma 63. Going over components, the quarter-inch jacks are the Rian style open frame jacks. We have a stereo jack here for the input, which is going to turn off. Well, usually what it's used for is to turn off the battery snap for a 9-volt battery, but of course there is no battery snap. So in this case, it's probably just making it so that the DC is disconnected. We can actually test that real quick. Probably just lifts one of the connections for the DC power when no input jack's installed. Yeah, so no power, no LED with no input jack. But if we plug in an input jack, then we can get power, and it is a red LED in there. So I should specify, it's not just one of the connections, it's the ground connection. It has to be, because when you plug in a mono or TS quarter-inch jack, it's going to be the upper area of this grounding portion that connects to the ring connection for the stereo jack here. So right here, this ring tab is hitting the ground point, the same point that's hitting the sleeve of the jack, and that's what's attaching to the ground or center connection for this. So when you disconnect this, it just disconnects this ground point on the DC jack from circuit ground and enclosure ground. The pots in there, you can see the logo, they're the Vimex pots. Can't see the lower ones, but presumably the same, and hopefully with pot covers. Oh, actually, I can actually see here they have some sort of like black plastic or foam protecting the back of the pots. That's cool. Sticking out right here on top is the transformer. This is a TY141P. Anyone familiar with the Hudson broadcast will recognize this. It's the same transformer used in the broadcast. I think. Yeah, when I built a broadcast a while ago, I bought my own, a couple of these. These are not cheap transformers. I think they're like 14 or 15 bucks. And it looks like this one was made just 2 months before mine, so interesting. Foot switch is just standard blue foot switch, kind of high actuation pressure. You know, sturdy, reliable, readily available. The LED here, we saw it was red before. It's pushed down into that bezel and then hot glue applied on top. And then here's your current limiting resistor coming right over here to the switch. I like the idea of hot glue, keeping stuff intact. You don't want that LED falling through into the enclosure. I kind of don't like the way this put together though. It just seems a little haphazard. It would have been nice, like I think we've seen on like Earthquaker, where the leads of the LED will just come up here to a spot on the PCB and then actually just have the current limiting resistor somewhere on the PCB and then a wire coming over here to the foot switch. This just looks a little, maybe a little more homebrew than I like for like a production company, but maybe they're keeping that for that exact reason. They want it to look handmade and custom. So that's more of a personal choice, I guess. I like the hot glue. I like the strain relief. That's cool. Could have taken this little nub of hot glue off though, because this, I don't see that this is doing anything. If this was doing something, then why isn't there hot glue over here? So this is maybe just a little sloppy. This piece of hot glue could come off and it would at least just look a little better. As far as components, we have blue box film caps here, metal film resistors, 1/4 watt, a couple of electrolytics. This here is probably a Nichicon Gold. Yeah, Nichicon Gold. This is a 22 microfarad. 22 microfarad, anytime you see that in a tube amp based circuit, it's almost definitely a bypass cap. It's just like the classic value for some reason. Everybody just uses that forever for bypass caps. There's probably is a good reason, like a frequency roll off point or something, but yeah, anytime you see a 22 microfarad, it's probably what it's doing. And then up here is a 100 microfarad, also Nichicon. That's probably a power filtering cap. Snuck down inside, you will see there are a couple of JFETs, 4 I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, 4 JFETs. These are the surface mount version of the J201. J201 is extremely popular choice for JFETs in a tube amp replicating circuit because of the low pinch off voltage and the very low idle current. I can't remember the part number. It's like, hold on, let me look it up. Okay, yeah, the part number is MMBF J201. And the markings, yeah, unfortunately there's a good bit of flux around the board where those were pretty clearly hand soldered on. And so I can't really see the markings on any of them, but they are J201s. And the surface mount part is MMBF J201. The through-hole J201s are out of production from, well, Fairchild doesn't exist anymore. They were bought by ON Semiconductor. ON doesn't make them anymore though either. There is someone, I think Interfet is still making J201s, but they're like $3 or $4 a piece. You can get the surface mount ones really easily though. As it stands, DigiKey, it's the August 26th, Saturday. DigiKey has almost 16,000 in stock, so if you're looking to get some, now might be the time. They do go out of stock, and they do go like on back order for months. So you can probably see here for all of the JFETs, they have biasing trim pots and little test points. That's the open solder pads here. So 1, 2, 3, 4 trim pots, and then 1 for each JFET, and then test points. This is a good idea because JFETs can vary pretty wildly from the manufacturing tolerances, and you will have to trim the drain resistance in order to get a specified drain voltage in order to bias the JFET. The person who sent me this pedal was complaining that it doesn't sound right, and when I looked at the schematic and saw that there's 4 separate knobs to turn, so somebody could get in there with a screwdriver and mess things up, I imagine that was probably what it was. Not accusing the person who sent me the pedal of doing that, but maybe they bought it from somebody who messed with it, or maybe, you know, it was a Friday afternoon at Greer and they already had a couple and just didn't set it right. So either way, we will be checking the bias on those test points to make sure they're sitting at about half the supply voltage, somewhere around 4 or 4.5 volts. All right, so here's the schematic for the Soma 63. We're gonna have a quick look at this, and then we're gonna jump over to some schematics from the Fender brownface amps to see how this was kind of put together. So starting off, we have a couple resistors and capacitors. Going into our first JFET stage, 1.5K source resistor, 100K trim pot is the drain resistance. Out of that, through a capacitor here, into this tone stack, you can kind of see where Leo was starting to put together the classic or iconic Fender tone stack. The brownface was sort of a transitional period between the very early Fender amps and the blackface era. And you can see where he's starting to build that ladder of treble, bass, mid, that would be what we associate with the iconic Fender tone stack. So treble control 250K, gain control 500K, and the bass is also 500K. The gain has a little tail resistor here that keeps it from muting the pedal when you turn the gain knob all the way down. Into our next JFET stage, this has a bypass around this stage for more gain, 22 microfarad, that's the gold Nichikami saw. Another 100K trim pot. Into our third stage here, this has a split source resistance. So you have a 1 meg here kind of splitting these two, this voltage divider that's coming up back to the gate. This is going to bias the JFET differently. You're going to have a DC voltage here at the junction of these two resistors, and that's going to come up and bias the gate more positive. And then we have another trim pot up here on the drain. Out of that through a cap into the last JFET stage, pretty similar to the first one, just a different source resistance, 1K versus 1.5K, and then another and the last 100K trim pot. Out of that through some more caps and resistors, presence control, and then down here to the transformer, and then the output through the 100K volume pot. The transformer here is not going to be like it is in tube amps because the output from this pedal is single-ended. There is no phase splitting that's sending out of phase signals to either side of the transformer. There's also no need to do any impedance conversion. We're not trying to hook up a low impedance output like a speaker. It's going to go into another pedal. And so the transformer here is more being used just as essentially sort of like a clipping diode to try to distort the transformer. It's used in the exact same way in the Hudson broadcast. Whether or not that makes a huge difference to the sound, I'm sure there's plenty of people who argue about that. I won't. So this is the Soma 63. Also, power stuff here is pretty standard. 9 volt in. This is a 5817 or similar protection diode. Here's the clipping diode and the LED. This here, this little resistor, this is just a filter resistor, 47K, and then 2 filter caps, 100 microfarad, 100 nanofarad, and then out, that's the power source for these drains. So that is the Soma 63. Let's have a look at a couple brownface schematics. So it's a mishmash of two, more or less, as much as you can really do with recreating a tube amp and a pedal. So the first half, we can start to see here where we have our input stage through the first triode. JFETs are being sub for triodes here, so you can see here's our JFET. This comes down, this says C. C is down here. This value is 820 and it's bypassed down here, where over here it's just a 1.5K with no bypass. But the tone stack is pretty similar. We have our slope resistor, we have our bypass cap here, we have the bass control. This is a 10 nanofarad, this is the 33 nanofarad. 10K is also to ground though, so that's the tone stack here is pretty similar to this. This is the 6G5 Pro Amp brownface, and that goes out here. There's your treble control and your gain control, so that's pretty similar. This has a capacitor input to the next triode. There's Soma 63 is not. Now this one on the top channels here, this I guess is the vibrato channel. This has a split plate resistance up here, but down here it's more similar to this, where it's just a single 100K with the 220K up here at the plate. However, the Pro Amp here, this comes out and this comes through a long tail pair phase inverter for the two 6L6 GCs, and that goes to either side of the primary of the output transformer. But again, this pedal is single-ended, so there is no push-pull, there is no phase inversion necessary. But we do have this sort of situation here with the split source resistance, and that is present on what I would consider like the iconic brownface amp, which is the 62 Princeton. Princeton does not have the tone stack that we saw in the Pro Amp and the Soma 63 here, but it does have this split cathode here, which is a 1K resistance and a 5.6K compared to the 680 and 5.6K here, and then a 1 meg resistor coming up, and in this case biasing the grid for the tube, and in this case biasing the gate for the JFET. And then it goes out through another gain stage JFET out through the transformer for the Soma. For the Princeton here, that splitting is part of this phase inverter, which is called a cathodiene phase inverter, and you're taking signal off the plate, which is going to be one phase, whatever it is, it'll up going there, and then off the cathode it's the opposite, it's going to be down going here. And then you feed that to your two output tubes, in this case 6V6, again to the output transformer. The Soma will still take output here. It introduces the presence control, which is fine. But then it takes here, it goes through the output transformer, quote unquote, but that's just connected to the ground, essentially like clipping diodes. Hopefully you can see where Greer got the inspiration for this pedal. Pretty clear that they are replicating the circuit of the brownface amps just as much as they may be replicating the sound. It's not necessarily true that replicating the circuit will get you the sound of the brownface, and in fact that's a pretty dubious claim considering this pedal is going to exist somewhere in a long chain of stuff between your guitar, whatever it is, other pedals, your amp, your room. There's a lot that goes into making like a setup sound like a specific amp. Not to mention, there isn't one brownface sound. There is a maybe brownface sound from some famous recording at some point that was most likely a different guitar, different amp, maybe different pedals, maybe not, definitely different room. So Amp in a Box, the whole idea is a little bit, it's a little bit farcical to try and like recreate the sound. It's more straightforward to recreate the circuit, but there's no guarantee doing so will get you the sound. So, but if you instead just take it as sort of like, I just want to pay homage to some famous old amps that I really like and recreating the pedal and circuit. And if the pedal sounds good, even if it may not sound exactly like brownface, is that good enough reason? I would say, yeah, probably. All right, so like I said, the owner of this pedal said it is not sounding right, so we're going to check the bias points on these 4 trim pots to make sure they're sitting at about half supply voltage, about 4.5 volts, something like that. So DC voltage, we'll clip on our ground. Let's see if we can get here. And plug in power and jack. So let's test the first test point. So like I said, we want to see somewhere between 4 and 4.5 volts on all these test points here. Starting with the first one, first test point there. Yeah, so that's nowhere close to what it should be. We're going to bring that up to somewhere in there, like 4 and something like that. Here's test point 2. Okay, way off. Yeah, someone's definitely messing with these trim pots. Put that back somewhere in that range. That's fine. There's test point 3 is in there. Again, way off. Now, I should say there is no right or wrong. It's subjective. Maybe someone at some point really liked the sound of the pedal as it sits, and they wanted probably like a really spitty, fuzzy sound. But the original owner said it wasn't sounding like what they were expecting, and this is almost definitely why. That looks good there. And I don't believe any of these JFETs are direct coupled. They're all capacitor coupled, so none of the DC points on any of the transistors should affect the others. But just for testing purposes, we'll go back and check. That looks good there. It's good there. Good there. And good there. Okay, cool. So now we're sitting at about half supply voltage. That's going to give you maximum swing out of the JFET, and that's probably going to restore the original sound to the owner the way Greer would have set it up coming out of the factory. All right, that was a teardown of the Greer Amps Soma 63. If you have any questions or recommendations for pedal you want to see on an upcoming teardown episode, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate you hitting the like button and subscribing. I'm Joe from GrayBenchElectronics. Thanks for watching.